Good evening, dear students, colleagues, and the audience online. Welcome to the Professors of XJTLU Public Lecture. 欢迎各位莅临在西普听讲座。I'm Professor Bei Tang from the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. It's my great pleasure to be the academic chair of this lecture series. Professors of XJTLU Public Lecture is our university's signature event for scholarly communication and knowledge dissemination. At XJTLU, now we have around 50 professors through whom we would like to promote our unique research culture. This public lecture series will be delivered by XJTLU professors from different research fields, introducing their career-long research or a comprehensive review of selected research topics, as well as the cutting-edge development in the field. The lecture series will be offered throughout the academic year to both XJTLU staff and the students, as well as the public audiences. Through stimulating presentations using plain language, the professors of XJTLU Public Lecture Series will explain complex research topics and bring showcase of our university's research impact and its contribution to our community and society. Today's speaker is the Dean of the Design School at XJTLU, Professor Marc Schnabel. Professor Schnabel is a renowned expert in digital design, digital transformation, and extended reality environment. Before joining XJTLU in 2023, he worked as the Dean for the Faculty of Architecture and Design Innovation at the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand for 7 years. And before that, he worked in Hong Kong, Japan, Australia, and Germany. Trained as an architect, Professor Schnabel has been the president of several professional organizations, including the Architectural Science Association, the Association for Computer-Aided Architectural Design Research in Asia, and the Autodesk Industry Advisory Board. Professor Schnabel has also researched virtual reality, digital heritage, and intelligent cities as a principal investigator of New Zealand National Science Challenge, Better Homes, Towns, and Cities. Throughout his 25-year career, Professor Schnabel has published extensively on digital architecture, urban design, and augmented virtual realities, and curated several digital architecture exhibitions. He has also established the Digital Architecture Research Alliance and the online network Urban Digitalics, connecting professionals and researchers in innovative digital design. Today, Professor Schnabel will discuss how digital design and virtual reality can transform spaces into welcoming and creative environments for everyone. Professor Schnabel will speak for about an hour, and then we will open the floor for questions and discussions, and we will take questions from the audience both on-site and online. So without further ado, I give you Professor Marc Schnabel.
Thank you for the very nice introduction, and really thank you for having me here today. I'd really be excited and very humbled to give you a little bit an overview of some of the works which I was engaged in, and I hope I inspire you and bring you to new ideas and new horizons. So it's titled Breaking Boundaries. Not in terms of really breaking it, but to think about what are the boundaries, what can we do with them, and how does it inspire us in a creative process, and how can we use that in a digital and physical realm. So talking about the digital realm, so the first thing is where people say, yeah, we use a computer, we use different tools and so on. But if you think in the design environment, the digital tool or the digital designing is not a tool, it is actually a way of how we engage, how we think about design. And that becomes very interesting. So because we're not just using things like, to execute something, but we use the computational environment as a partner in our design environment. Now, everybody talks about AI. So I went to AI and put my title and the short blob into the AI image generation. That's what's come out. So this is what you not hear today, right? So this is very interesting. So we have tools, so they generate now content, but the content is not the content which we actually produce, which we want. So we have to engage in that and question what's actually out there. Now, this is what students do when they work with AI. Right? It's a very different environment, and obviously they engage differently, have more time, and massage that differently. So there is a in and out of using different technologies to come out to a very interesting new idea, and that was a competition in Japan where they developed a new transport system in a city and developed sort of that gondola thing which can go on this rail, can go into the water and so on, and have a different way of how one engage in a Japanese environment. So that was it just an idea using the tools and come out with a very different thinking, a different environment. Now, the design studio. So how do we work as designer? As designer, it's a messy, interesting activity where you do things and you see where your inspiration comes from, and you use these different inspirations to come to work in your design. Now this can be physically, that can be with computer, that can be all different medium. This is now a design studio at a different university, but that is, you could say, that is a place where you work, you move into this place, and design never sleeps. Design is never finished. Design is finished when the deadline comes. Right, and that is very interesting because in other disciplines you know where your end is. As designer, you be always on the job. Basically, even on holiday, you walk, you go through the city, and you see something, and you already get your inspiration. So even on holidays, but this is where some people engage in themselves. Now this is. You think, okay, this was on a university. No, this is when you become an architect and you work in some offices. Okay, this is now a little bit now 10, 15 years ago, where sort of you see the transaction between the digital and the analog system. That's very sad, actually. You don't want to work there, buried, and you can't talk to your colleague and so on. So this is not where we work now, right? But what I want to show with that, it's an engagement with different media in different ways. So you be in the digital, you be in the analog, and it is a social engagement where you hopefully meet your colleagues and you talk to other people. So this is the thing. So this is much more where you socially engage, you meet different people online, in person, and you discuss your design, you learn from the peers, and you get your inspiration through that. Sure, in COVID times, we had to see different ways of how we deal with the situation and how we can communicate, and we all were sort of suddenly screen-based, and we had the thing where we work on something, then we have the screen. But this is really interesting of how the students suddenly work in that context very differently. So use the tracing paper on the screen to trace something through the screen, or show something to the camera, what was sketched, so that it becomes that the engagement between the physical and the digital. Right. I don't know whether you had the chance to walk through the tunnel today. So this is just what we had today, our presentation of the work in the Architectural Design Studio. So this is the tunnel which connects the north and the south campus here, and which is normally really just a thoroughfare. And we took over that space and said, how can we now populate that and make use of that space, that it becomes really a bazaar, like, it becomes a very exciting place of activity creativity, and it communicates what we do in design not only to our peers, but to everybody in the university. And you go there casually by on your way to lunch, and you have a discussion with and see what's going on. So this is important. We want to communicate our design to the outside. We want to bring it out because we not only design for ourselves, we design in a larger context, and we have to bring that into this larger context. All right. So a change anywhere is a change everywhere. In the computational environment, you always can change. And when you do one change, it has an impact everywhere around it. And that's also very different in working environment, because if you write on a piece of paper or you do something there is a change. There is not so much change. It's there. You have to really erase or start from the beginning. In a computational environment, you always say, well, I can change it. I can change it. I'm not yet finished. I can change it. And that, again, is the thing. You never finish, and that is a problem. How do you find out when you change, and how can you deal in that environment? Now, this is a little drawing from my daughter some years ago, right? And that's also interesting to see that how people engage with creativity actually in every age and everything. So we don't have to be now a designer trained all the way through. We are creative. We want to communicate our ideas to people, but sometimes it is very hard and difficult. But it liberates us. Now, Degas had philosophy talking about the dualism. And the dualism, in a very simple way, is how your mind and your body communicates to each other. So in your mind, you can say, I'm on a diet, I'm not eating anymore. But after some time, your body says, oh, I'm really hungry, and there's nice cake, I don't care, I eat it. Right? So who wins? It's just like always this discussion between the mind and the body in terms of how the interaction works. Now, if you translate that into a creative process where you have the designer, and the designer has an idea, and the idea has to come out of the mind, so use maybe a tool, an instrument, so the digital environment, and that is the same thing. You have now this discussion between what do you actually think, what your design wants to be, and how it should be, versus what the tool, the instrument can do, or what you are able to actually express in this context. And certain things you don't think of it, and it comes out, and you think, wow, this is a very great inspiration. Let's take that and translate it into the next step. And here you see Albrecht Dürer is a German painter from the Renaissance. He thought, how can we actually use this different techniques and things that one can learn of how to draw, how to represent ideas. And he invented very simple machines where you can trace certain shapes and so on, that you get then an outline and a drawing. Now with this machine and these ideas, basically everybody could start drawing and be able to communicate their ideas to a certain extent. And then as an artist, you can explore that much more. And Albrecht Dürer was obviously an expert in drawing and painting. Drawing and painting is, in an Asian context, a very established thing. We all know manga. We all know manga drawing. We love mangas. Anybody reads manga? Yeah, very good. Yeah, you go to Japan, you know, everybody has a manga. But this is a very established culture of how you communicate actually a narrative, a story of, you know, what's happening in a very particular way, using just black and white line drawings. So this process to produce a manga drawing is a very manual process. So you have your original image of what you have, or your idea, and you have to translate that into a black and white line drawing in a hatch system. So you can use different software which give you a hatching filter. This is output, but this is not really a manga drawing. This is just that style what the computer translates it. You can use halftone, and then you get this kind of halftone outcome, right? But that is also not really what a manga drawing is. So what the manga drawing is, they would take the outline and have then foils which they glue into, or manually put for each different thing the matching texture. And to find this texture and the thing is very difficult, because you want to find what is actually the material texture and the color, and have that then similar represented in different parts of the drawing, so that when you look at this black and white thing, that you feel the spatial thing. So with my colleague together, we developed a system which is an automatic system. So this is our method. So where you now see of how the different textures and the quality of the drawing comes out, and it becomes a very alive picture, very alive to it, and it has a kind of a feel of the actual quality of the material. The color is no color as black and white, but you understand that suddenly very differently. Now, a manga is typically a way of where a character, a person, interacts with other people in front of a background, which is often architectural. Now, the idea is, can we turn that around and have the manga story so that the background or the architecture actually as the character, the main thing, and by that communicate what the architecture is about. So instead of having plan, section, elevation, which is very difficult for people to understand if you're not trained as an architect, you can use a manga drawing to communicate your ideas. And by going through a manga drawing, you get a very good idea of what the building is about and so on. Similar in a movie, you can see a movie and you understand somehow what it is. You maybe don't get all the construction details right, but that is not the point. The point is that you give the feeling and the idea of what the building is, and that you can communicate that to an audience, or to your designer, to your expert, who can then take that material and produce then the work which you want to do. And here you see some outcomes where now a building is communicated, and you go in different aspects of it, and you get a feel of what the building is, what the spaces are, without that you have been there, without that there is a plan, section, elevation, and you probably have a better understanding of the building than if I would have shown you now a plan of that the same space. And here, and you can go also in urban context, you know, how you go in an urban context and collect by that different patterns, different experiences, what's happening in that street, and have sort of a more an urban context explanation of it. Or you bring that then further into a animation, so that is an urban simulation software, which normally is only there for really do real-time data, the simulation of traffic flow and pedestrian flow in an urban environment, and the rendering is, you know, as this kind of software is kind of not perfect or as photorealistic, is a bit odd, but by bringing it into now a very different environment, it's not a perfect manga drawing, but it suddenly expresses things in a very different way, where you now can concentrate on aspects of what you simulate and what you want to communicate in a very different way. And it is now really just goes through the city, but the idea is to help the simulation software and the simulation team to give a different story of how traffic flow is and how the city is, and a different understanding in this one. Now, a designer normally has no problem. A designer creates the problem. And if I now be very rude to engineers, then I would say the engineer has the problem. The engineer has to solve the problem which the designer generated. All right, it's not quite like that, right? But if you think about it, you have a white piece of paper, or you have an empty screen, there is nothing there which is a problem, it's just there is an emptiness. But by starting, putting the first line, the first put, you suddenly define what you do in a very different way. And with a line, you have the right, the left, or top or bottom side, and by that you frame actually what you do. So the problem framing becomes very interesting. So you describe something, and you start to find an answer around it. And normally in a design process, there is not a very clear answer, you know, 1 + 1 is 2. There is like something plus something, what is that? right? It is not defined what it is, so you have to find solution for that, and by that you frame parts of it, and you formulate your design process in that way differently. Now, if you think of the Sydney Opera House, and maybe you have been there, you have seen it, right? Fantastic building. But if I would say to you, describe that in a plan section elevation, how is that? It's very difficult, it's probably impossible. And when they designed it and built it, it was also impossible to design and to calculate. The engineer could not really solve that problem because it is a very complex building and it is three-dimensional. And this is now the interesting part, and this is where we now deal in the design school. Everything is a three-dimensional aspect. We have to think in 3D and we have to work in 3D, and that offers us a different understanding, different communication of spaces. So you have here the idea of these sails, and once they realized these sails are all segments of different spheres, suddenly you could solve the structural problem, and you could design and build the building. But it is about the spatial understanding of the building. Now, talking of the sphere and so on, right, that is nothing new. That is what was done already by Romans nearly 200 years ago in the Pantheon. It's a building which from the outside you can see is, fairly sort of not really decorated. You go in there, but once you're in there, it is a building which fits a perfect sphere in there. And you see that in the roof is expressed and the rest of it. So there is suddenly something, when you describe the Pantheon as a building, you describe it not necessarily as a temple or as something which from the outside, but you describe it from the inside out, that it is has this round dome, there is a sphere fits in, there's this hole in the middle, and the hole goes through the floor and gives different shadow effects depending on the time when you are, and suddenly you describe the building spatially and you think spatially about it. Now, this idea was picked up again through the centuries, and we have here a Boulez who had an idea of a cenotaph for Newton. It's basically a planetarium where you can see the stars, and that one. It was never built. You only have these 5 drawings, but it's one of the most talked about buildings in architectural history. So this is quite interesting of how you can have an impact by just communicating something, which is was a 2D paper drawing, but what you communicate is actually the space. You communicate the three-dimensionality rather than just the 2D expression. And it goes through here to the Vienna secession, and I come back to that again. Here, more recently, in the 70s, here that building von Haus Ruckert, which is an inflated space outside of a art museum, and you go out on that staircase, and there is a very nice seat, and you sit in paradise suddenly within a city in a different environment. So you step out of a building, and you step into suddenly in paradise, and you sit there and you go back. So it's an interesting part of how you engage suddenly in a virtual context, and it is a virtual bubble, you could say. It's real, it's virtual, where you step out of your normal life and step into a different oasis, into this kind of feel of beach and palm tree and hang mat, without that you be there, but it gives you the impression. Now, this is a space where we all interact with, in which way I also interact a lot. So we have, on one hand, we have reality. That's where we are. And the people and the audience online is probably more in the virtual space and the mixed media space. And it goes all the way to virtuality. Now, that becomes very interesting if you think about on that line that reality and virtuality is something very different. So it means if you are in a virtual environment, you are not in a copy of reality. You are actually in its own definition of what it is. And very often we realize, or if we go use AI tools, if we use VR, we think of, yeah, that is something real and I can fly and so on, but it's a sort of a bad copy of reality. Actually, reality sits here, has its own definition, and the virtual environment sits here and it has its very different. So if we copy and bring in ideas from reality to virtual and try to see that, why don't we bring ideas from the virtual into the real and see of how that can influence our lives around here. And I will show you a couple more of these elements. A lot of people talk about Internet of Things, which is interesting, but I would push more the Internet of Spaces. Internet of Things is like gadgets in space, and it's gadget-driven. The Internet of Things is where we actually, as people, we are also players. We also want to be in that thing, and we interact with each other, and we interact with technology, and we act in that sort of a realm between the physical and the digital, the real and the virtual. So it becomes the Internet of Spaces rather than the Internet of Things. And in the spaces, are the different actors. Now, many years ago, before the first computer came and then they came up, they thought, okay, what does an architect designer need in a computer? Well, this is what they need, right? And if you look at that idea, the sketch of how a designer would work in the future, there is a lot of things still parallel what a typical computer is, right? So we have a screen, and we have a big keyboard, obviously. We have different viewpoints, plan sections, so different viewports we can see. We have kind of a mouse here, very big machine. We have here the connection to the internet, and we have our hard disk or our cloud in the back. Now, this is just kind of interesting that this desktop metaphor, right, of how a translation in a from a real into a virtual environment sort of still sticks with us in the way of how we work and interact. Well, then computer came up, and we had more complicated drawings and buildings, and then we use the tools to produce here, that is service drawings, and that is sort of a typical drawing where you have different electricity and MAP, air conditioning, different services in one plan. Now, if I give that to a builder and say, this is what you do, very hard time. But that's what people give. They have to read this. Now, if I am as a designer or anybody makes a mistake in this context, nobody will see that. And you be then on the construction site and you realize it doesn't work. Because that was the way of how we communicated these ideas in a 2D environment, which is actually spatial. So this is where then the computer involved, and we say, okay, we bring that actually in a 3D space, and we build everything 3D, and we express it 3D. So it's kind of the same building, different parts of it, but this is now suddenly 3D, and it became so complex that we had to use different software, and we used software from the aerospace industry, because they realized very early that an airplane is a three-dimensional object, and everything is multidimensional in there. It's not only the 3D, but also of how different forces work on that when it flies. And so by suddenly taking something from a very different discipline into the design discipline, you use this tool in a way of how you want to engage very differently. And here, different shots of this one, so you can now virtually prototype the building before you actually build it and see what the issues are. And in this context, you can also see where you have maybe clashes or things which which didn't work on it, and you could fix it. Now, this drawing is more or less the same what I showed you earlier with a 2D drawing. This just becomes clearer in terms of how you have to build something and how to implement things. Now, you realize it becomes, if you want to talk with a computer, you not only can have that in a visual context. At one point, you need to do coding, and you have to explore that with the scripting. And there's different ways of how you engage in scripting, without being now a computer engineer, that you really do the hardcore coding. And so there was a software developed, and this one every architect uses, every designer uses. And it becomes now basically the scripting method rules the world. Now use that, and suddenly it generates more complex shapes, and you can translate that quickly. And now connected with AI, you can actually produce now these outcomes, all these details, where you don't have to draw now every little detail on it. Actually, the computer code can now write a code for itself to generate this outcome. So you say what the design intent is and what you want to have, but you see this as these different elements come together. The code writes itself and improves itself, that it can put all these elements in there, and then you say in the different levels of it, and generates that. And then you can get the data which is then produced there, directly to a manufacturing machine, which then produces the machines, and you put them there together. It becomes a big puzzle, basically, but you put them together because you don't start designing everything anymore. This is where the computer comes in. You give the intent, and the computer can then solve all the little details and problems for you, and you don't have to do all that anymore. Now, this is how we use tools in a different way of how they're supposed to be used. So, for example, the airplane software we use in a different context, and that was the same when photography came up. Man Ray in the 30s developed sort of a different way of what you can do, or misuse a camera, that you get this thing. And we all know about the light pen, and Jörn Utzon is the guy who designed the Opera House. They also start sketching in that one. And Calder Mobile basically had 2D shapes, developed 2D shapes, put them on a wire, and by them moving in space, they suddenly become a 3D object, the 2D, 3D object, and you put them into photography and you get the same outcome. So you think very differently of how you can now translate ideas in different environments. Now, this is a virtual design studio which I did 25 years ago. For really the beginning of VR. And you see the headset, same thing and so on, but students were here working together and exploring together. And what we developed was a very simple gesture recognition system. So instead of that you complicated do things, you just have a pen in the hand, and you see that in your environment, and you generate simple forms. Up and down translates into a cone or a cube, cylinder, whatever you have, and depending how big the gesture it is, the large or small that becomes, and you place it in the place where you want to have it. And then you, like a playground, basically put these shapes together, and you get something like this as an outcome. Now, this is not architecture, it's not really the design, but it's a way of how you can communicate your idea using now this technology in a very different way, which allows then a designer to say, okay, what was the intent, and then translate that into a more buildable context. So we use that, and we engage students in Hong Kong, as well as in Switzerland and in Canada. So they all work together across the boundaries, different timelines. We put them into a social context, and that's important, that you have not only the work which you do, but you put them, you archive these things, put them together, you see who's working together. So it was basically what Facebook is nowadays, that already set up in a very early context of how you socially interact in a design environment which is virtual, without that you necessarily meet the people, but you engage meaningful with them in this context. And then there's different ways of how you can do that. And if you look at the gadgets, this was also, as many years ago, we had actually very small VR headsets and AR headsets. And with that, you could now explore an urban context. You can design in this realm, or you go into details. You have different sessions where you talk about what your design is. You have light tables, which brings up the design in different contexts. But this is the interesting part. This is the representation of your design using different media in a very simple way, which is sort of organic to your environment. Now, once you have these headsets, you can track the people of what you actually do, where you look at, because it's very simple to track the eye movement. And by that one, you can then see of how people use an environment, a simulated environment, in what they actually see. So there is now a person standing in that street environment and looks around, and you can now test certain urban scenarios, or you can test of how people see, let's say, traffic lights or so. And in this side, you see where the person is looking, and you can then analyze the information accordingly. So that's the same thing again. So the person is standing here at a traffic intersection, looks around what the traffic is, while on that side you can then see where the person actually looked, and every voxel is basically a focus point, and depending on the size and the length, how long they look at it, you can then get the data and understanding of how people use a certain urban environment. And then again, here that in a different scenario, that's the scramble crossing in Tokyo. Now, that allows you to design your city different, your building different. It allows for people who do advertisement also something very interesting, because they understand where you look at. But it allows you also in terms of navigation. For example, if you have an airport or so, how do people actually see how to navigate through the airport, or if there's an emergency, that people know how to go out of the place. That allows you to fully understand the space which you build as a post-evaluation to see what people do there. Now we thought, that's interesting. If we can look at things and know where people look at, can we reverse the sense of looking, which is a one-way thing, is you see something, that by looking at something you generate something. So that you use your eyes to generate and to design things. And that becomes an interesting aspect, where you now use your sense not only as a one-way, you use it as a two-way. So you see and you generate something at the same time. And you can, here this is just a very simple aspect, you can generate or subtract things like Boolean operations, but it allows you to do both at the same time. That takes a little while when you do the first time, because you're like, whoa, what's happening? But it's an interesting thing that we use our senses not only for the way where we used to it, but we use our senses in a multidimensional system. Now, if you translate that not only for the visual, so how would that work with your ears? That you not only hear, that you actually can generate the sound, or with taste and other touch and so on, with all your other senses. Now we tried it out with the sense, with the visual, because as a designer you obviously do a lot in the visual, in the context of the visual. But that became a very interesting tool to engage in a virtual environment, and that's something which you only can do in a virtual environment, and that informs the reality. So you do something, not copy, but you do something which is native to a virtual environment, and that allows you to understand the design process and your outcome, your design, and then you bring that into a more real context. See that how that goes through. And so you can then make that sophisticated a little bit more, and bring that up to a bit more quality level, and put more menu points into it, which you then can pick up. So you make that a bit more sophisticated, where you use then also your hands, but mainly your eyes. And so you work now suddenly with your eyes, with your hands, so sort of your whole body gets involved in the process of designing. And you design your work around yourself, rather than that you design something you'd be distant on the screen. So because you be immersed in it, and you do everything just around yourself. And it continues like that. Good, what else do we have? Now, yes, here. The next one. Let's take it a bit to a different level, to a different area. So this is Kashgar. Kashgar is the most western city on the Silk Road in China. And Kashi, it is an Islamic city, and that is the old town as it used to be, and or the old area. This is a very old town. And so the city decided we have to do urban renewal, develop this thing. It is too small grain and it's not really contemporary. So they decided to remove most of the part and just keep a little bit of it. So you see here is the old town was and the new development of the city. Right? Now we thought, how can we capture the essence of the old town and the old living and the building and the architecture around that in a different environment and have our own interpretation. So you see how things, develop in this context, and it's a little bit from the old town. And this is sort of the infrastructure where people live, and when they needed a bit more space, well, then they took some stones or put here a roof, and they had another room. And if they not used it anymore, well, it could give to the neighbor, or it was open. So there was a very flexible way of how the city evolved and how the city is used in this context. So. We went there, used photogrammetry, basically taking pictures, and based on these pictures, we then built a 3D model, or used a computer who builds the 3D model, and we used the textures and the colors to generate a model of this old town, and you see that is now building this thing together. And then we put some atmospheric aspects into it. Kashgar has sometimes a desert storm where the sand comes over, and with the sunlight it becomes very orangey. And put this together, and you'll see with this model, when you do this photogrammetry, there's a lot of errors happen, so mistakes. And that's how the computer can't really solve certain things because it doesn't have enough information. But we thought this is really fantastic if there is not enough information, because it allows the user to interact with the city and help in fixing this, or build up the city, or generate the city as it was done earlier, that people just picked up stones and elements to build their city and change it and leave basically marks. So there's different textures of the environment, and and then there's different ways of how you can use that. So we had this very big projection screen, spheric, so you don't need any headset and so on. You just stand in front, and you have that feel of that you stand within the city environment. It allows for different users to go in there and see and experience and interact with that. So it was a thing for interaction for everybody, for people in Kashgar, for people outside, to see, oh, this is the city. How can I interact with this model? And I go through this, and this is now a little bit the outcome of how then the model looked like. And now somebody is going through that, the process of doing it. So we used drone flights to capture some of the details, and then we capture the textures, obviously, the space, the model, and put these things together. It's a long process. You see the errors, the white things where things are missing. And but you see suddenly the feeling of the city. You engage in that, but it is a very different representation. It's it's not the real environment. It's a different environment. It's a different quality, and it is not the real city. But it is something which relates you to the city and the culture and the architectural context. And here you engage in that in different ways. Now, once we had that, we thought, okay, you have on one hand that side where you build and you fix the city. There was this patches, and you put more context, and you could change your environment. But on the other hand, the city is not there anymore. It gets destroyed. So we thought, okay, how can we now have a second interaction, a second game, which symbolizes the destruction or the change of it. So this is what we built here. So this is a little figure which goes to an idealized city. So it's like an ideal city. It's not the real thing, but it's all picture perfect, and it's like very abstract. And you have this little figure, and you go through to this environment, and you destroy it. It's very fun. You hop along this path, and this path gets longer and longer where you hop, and then you see the buildings element and destroy them. So everything what you destroy, this material adds to the first one as material that you can actually build the city. And everything which you build in the first environment, which is more the photorealistic one, which I showed you, will then show up here that is actually built and you can destroy. So on one hand, you can play only one of these two entities and only do the destroy part or only do the build up part, but there is a relationship. And if not, people play both of that at one point, you run out of material or you have too many and so on, you can't continue anymore. But this is this very interesting thing that you at the beginning, you don't know there's this relationship, but you engage in that, and this destroying part is here in an abstract environment much easier because it's abstract, not real, so it's easy to destroy. And the other one, which looks a bit more real, is very easy to build up, and you don't want to destroy, you want to preserve that because of how you communicate the idea, and you can engage basically everybody in that one. Now, this is how Kashgar looks now. So most of it is destroyed, kept a little bit, and what you see here is not the real old building. They've rebuilt old buildings, and they have now the neon lights everywhere and LED lights, and yes, it's also not Kashgar anymore. It's something different. And you go there, and you have to pay. Without pay, you can't go there, right? So this is also, there was a city, very nice, built up, and it was free, and people used it, and now they destroyed it and realized, oh, we want to keep it, so we rebuild it again and make it pay. Well, imagine we put a pay gate at the entrance of the university. Also, it doesn't work, right? So it's an interesting part of how one can think what heritage is and how heritage is used in this context. And they have their good reason why they do a pay gate, but it becomes a very different engagement suddenly on the experience, what the city is, what is actually alive, what is the heritage, how do I engage with heritage, is this part of my life, is it something where I go and pay? And the same thing is in the virtual environment, you go there, it is not part of the real city, but it's a different translation of everything. Right? And if you now think of translation and tangible and intangible values, we talked about the heritage, there is obviously more to it. So for example, if you go now in more a spiritual environment, so what faith offers, there's a lot of things which is intangible and which we do very normal in an intangible heritage, but how do you bring that into a digital realm? So for example, here in Islam, it's a very important thing that when you do your prayers, that you do that orientated to Mecca. Now, if you're in a virtual environment, there is no Mecca. Any direction is right. So you have a fundamental aspect of how you practice a certain cultural ritual is not existing anymore. So how do you translate that in a different environment, that it's not a copy, but it is meaningful engagement in this thing, and that there is that heritage value. And so it is for the call for the prayer. It is, for example, the washing. How do you deal with water? The washing is a very interesting part because you feel that on your hands and you engage in that, and it's because this ritual is important. If in a virtual environment there is no virtual water, you would not do that. So how do you translate that? It becomes a very personal, artistic translation of how you deal with these things, and then also sort of what you do in a prayer context, right? It becomes something which you do as normal in a physical, but in a digital and a virtual environment, it's not there. You can't make a copy of it. So what can you make there that it becomes its own thing, which relates to the thing what you do? And there's obviously a lot of space to do this translation. Now, another topic is the Ars Electronica. Ars Electronica is a big fair or exhibition which deals with art, technology, and society. It's around for, nearly 40 years, where it expresses really cutting edge in this area. And when COVID hit, nobody could go to Linz in Austria anymore. That's where the festival is held. So we said, okay, we do a partner with them, and we do our own exhibition at that time it was in New Zealand, and communicate our ideas in New Zealand and bring that virtually as a contribution to the festival. So there we had the thing. We had on one hand the idea there is a physical exhibition. We have to have an exhibition space where people go and experience things. On the other hand, we want to communicate that to in a virtual environment. How do you do that? How do you can communicate a physical space in virtual, that it's not, again, the copy, but there is certain things and certain artworks within there. So this is one of the outcomes, so where we then put this kind of experience bubbles. You go there and you dive into this very different environment, which is the artwork and which is something in there, and then you can go to the next one and to experience the next environment. Now this is an experience which you could have in person there, and it was, displayed there, but you could also have that remotely or online. You still can go to the site and explore that then online, and there's then the different aspects, and it explains the different things. And some of them, what you see here now, I will quickly go through with you. So that work from LightSense from Uwe Wiege and Yin Lui is a very big installation, architectural installation. You could see it's a wing, a very big wing. It's maybe as big as here, the lecture hall, and it moves very slowly up and down, and there is light projection to it, texture mapping. And there is an AI system which generates the sound and talks to you. So you can talk to this installation and ask them any question. So like, how do you feel today? And the installation will answer and come back to you with a reaction to it. But this reaction is not only what they talk, but it's also in terms of how the wings reacts and flaps and how it feels. So if it's more angry, it will react differently than if it's smooth and happy.
I'm sad about you. What are you?
And it was very interesting that in that context, when people used it, that the voice system learned also of how people were talking to it and responding to that, what the vocabulary was, what the different conversations were, and then picking up on these conversations of somebody else earlier and say, I learned something there, and I try that out with a new person, and continue this discussion with everybody.
I love to explore new things. I love to keep my eyes open and...
Well, this work is exploring what is actually under the surface of the water. So New Zealand is surrounded by a lot of water, obviously. And if we now think about what is under the water, there's a lot of things spatially there, and we don't see that, we don't perceive that as actually a space, because we see only the water surface. Now, what is underneath the water? What space can you do, and how can you explore that? And that was this work where you see now in a micro scale of how air bubbles, water things, and different installation react to each other. You could say similar, like as people would react in a city, but in a very different environment, different medium. And there is this parallel and relationship which maybe give you then inspiration of how you can explore that in a different context of your own design environment. But on one hand, it's very easy to understand because you have the understanding of what water is in flow, but you can at the same time interpret that spatially. And then this is this work putting into a larger context where you now have the different artwork, the sound. There was somebody who write poems and bring this together in this installation. And here with Thomas Tucker, we worked on that project as an interesting thing of you have a unique experience within your virtual environment, and that's what you see. You see very abstract things, but you have at the same time, you have a puppeteer who is outside, standing in front of you, and interacting with you and giving you certain information what you see. So you see here the puppeteer holds the thing, and this is exactly the thing which you see under the virtual environment. And by the time you go there, you can interact and touch. You don't know there's a puppeteer because you don't see them. So suddenly the things become alive. It's not just a movie which you see, but there is really an interaction and an experience what you do within this virtual environment. And it reacts in terms of the sound, in terms of the movement. It also was connected to smell, so there was different smells coming out, and so you have suddenly a very different spatial engagement, which is very unique to only virtual environment, but it is informed through in the physical space. And then a translation of that where you don't need the headset anymore, so you just have these installations there, and now these pieces interact with you. So this is where, from the virtual environment, that's translated into a real environment, and you see of how that now interacts and informs your reality. Now, this project is, Alice in Wonderland. So Alice goes there, falls through the tunnel, goes into a different environment, and the question of scale, a different storyline. This is becomes this one, and we used a very simple technique, just cut out paper pieces, used again photogrammetry, what we used the same in Kashgar, and developed then with wrong colors a narrative around that what Alice in Wonderland can experience, because you now suddenly can allow it, that this environment allows you to explore that. Coming back to this Beethoven frieze, which is inside of the Xi'an. It's a very interesting painting and mosaic-like. If you now look at that, it looks a little bit like there's a glitch. There's something's happening with the computer that the display doesn't show right. Now, if you think about what is the glitch in the computer, the glitch is actually something very unique. We all had this experience that we have a file and an old image or something. So in this case, this image, we try to open it and we only see something like this. Or you have a movie, you open it, and before you can see the movie, it's all distorted and it's glitched. Now, the glitch is something which is actually not existing, because the computer file is there, and the computer can read it, and it opens it, but somehow what you see is not what you want. So where does the glitch happens? And that something happened in the computer where the computer decides, I cannot read the information or read the information in a different way, and I show you now a different outcome. So this picture here is actually exactly the same picture as that one, or the code in the middle. It's just different way of how you can communicate the same information. Now, if we use that and say, okay, we take the glitch image and we try to now interpret that glitch image spatially as an architect, like a musician would interpret a certain music score differently depending on the instrument they play. So we can now interpret that image spatially like this, and then put different materials on it, and then we get this kind of spatial expression of it. Now, this image here is not the same as the picture what you saw in the first place, because you can't interpret it. But it is somehow the same, because it's relayed on the same data, it's just spatially interpreted. So if I give you a music score, and there's dots and lines, you would say, don't really understand that, I'm not a musician. But a musician can interpret that. And the same thing, I can give you this picture to an architect who can interpret that image spatially and make then something spatially out of that information, and then apply different architectural material to it, so we like glass and steel and so on, and then suddenly get a very interesting urban context. And if you look at the Kashgar image, and so there is something which relates to that thing, which is, it is not the same, but it is a very different interpretation of it. And that becomes crucial, that as a designer, you use the material and you give it a new interpretation. And that's the same thing when you are just design, or anybody designs. You take something and you communicate it in a way, you give it a meaning, and you make an interpretation of what you have there. And then here just different images of the same file and different expressions. And then you can bring that again into an animation, the same file, and you realize that the computer glitches with itself, so it can't handle this file, and you get this interference, what you see there. So you have a perfect file, and you put it back. It's not actually an old file, it's just the computer handles the data in a very interesting way. And you bring that into a 3D environment, and it looks then very differently, and you have here now the spatial expression of it. And you can go further than that and say, okay, if I now really virtual, where is then reality? When I go in a pure virtual context, becomes a very philosophical question. How can I make an environment which is pure virtual and has no relationship with reality? So material doesn't play a role, light is something different, everything's different, and that becomes a very interesting question where you can do a lot of research in that context. Now I bring you back to life, okay? This is we are nearly done with our talk. So, augmented reality, I haven't talked about augmented reality, so where you map computer images with reality. And this is, for example, if you have the right glasses where you can get all this information there, what our future in 2 years can look like. You sit in the bus, gives you all the information perfect. You go out of the bus, and it tells you where to walk and all the different things for you, what your advertisement. Then it gives warning, clear the area. Why? Because the traffic is coming, so you step to the side, please. And, the barrier goes up. So you get all this information around it. Now, if you think about this, how the city defines itself through that, it requires a very different city design. It requires a very different way of how we think about design. It requires a very different, what is a window shop anymore? We don't need a window anymore because we can project everything. We don't need the light anymore because we have the light there and we can project things. And the same, if we really would go shopping, not order everything online, suddenly that experience becomes also something very different. And we have to think about what is actually a shop, what is the experience. So you not only design the space itself, you have to design the whole experience around it. And that becomes a very new task for designer and architect. All right, I'll leave you with this one. Quickly, another thing is our NFT vending machine. So you generate files and you generate all these documents in the virtual environment. How do you know that this is actually yours and is authentic? If you have a real painting, you know which one is the real one and the copy. So with blockchain and NFT, it allows you to give you the authentication of it. Now, this is only in a digital realm, but how do you bring that out? You have now your digital file authenticated. How can you now get that and use it actually? This is where you go to a vending machine, you have all these elements in there, and you can get your material. So you put all your NFT, or you want the one which you want to offer into the vending machine. You use the QR code, obviously nothing new, and you pay for it and you have that. So this is how the vending machine interface would look like. So okay, this is what you have there, and you select the one, it gives you all the detail of that item which you have, and you just go click and pay for it. And you get the physical and the digital file, you can have that. To wrap up, a little bit a nice thing, again, this bridge between where is the reality, where is the virtual. So having these kind of creatures which are designed in a virtual environment, and then brought out using 3D printers and different material printers, and put into the water and underwater, so different realm, using then air pressure to make them move, to get some very new interpretation of what forms, what interaction can be. And at that point, it doesn't really matter whether it is a real object or a virtual object, or in what sense you actually experience it, because it is the experience and the playfulness, and in this case, the interaction which you can have in terms of tactile or the visual context. Right, there's more of these to come, so you can come to my office and I give you more of these ones. Obviously, I work with a big team of people, and I really appreciate that they help me in this project and to realize that. Now, to wrap it up, Corbusier went to Rome, fantastic city, spent some time there, and then he sketched this sketch and said, well, Rome is basically just, you know, spheres and cylinders put together in an interesting way. So there's two very great things of that. He was not talking about squares and triangles, like 2D elements. He talks about 3D shapes. And he talks about very simple forms, and you put them together, and it doesn't matter, you can get a fantastic city like Rome. Well, what he's not talking about is, it's not only putting these things together, he's not talking about the culture and the people and the social engagement. And that's why a city works very well, because of the social engagement, because what we do, because that's why you're here, and to experience that. Now, I put the same question into the AI context, right? And the first one I used without the architect, and here I used it with the architect. This is what the outcome is of AI. It's definitely not Rome. So prefer, you know, the original drawing and the original engagement there. Well, and again, that was the AI, after I put some more information into the same thing, turned me into this person, and you realize my talk was very different in this context as what you saw there. I appreciate your time and your patience. Fantastic, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Marc Schnabel, for this fascinating talk. Now we would like to open the floor for questions and discussions. So if there's any question you would like to raise, please signal me. Thank you. Yes, please.
I was interested in you showed your old work. Between different schools, between different students trying to build architecture space in a virtual environment 25 years ago, you said. Now there's the Apple Vision Pro going on, so it's kind of democratized this technology, or at least it has the potential to democratize this technology. Do you have any thought about that and how you could be using it in your work?
Well, fantastic that you raise it. It's very interesting how things in technology come in waves, and how in design certain styles come in waves, and in fashion and so on you have that. And the same is with virtual environments. So it was very big in the late 90s, beginning 2000s, and then it suddenly stopped. And it's not available anymore. It was mainly because of the Kuwait war, where then the products was bought up by different militaries, and they could make more money with military than rather with consumer products. But there were fantastic devices already available. Now, 20 years later, it comes back, and so it's a new wave to it. Now, design is democratized in a way that you have now instruments which allow you to do things very quickly and very easily. It's not quite democratized in a way that is affordable for everybody. If we talk about some of the headset, it's just, it allows only certain people to use it. But what you get now online as tool and possibilities, this allows you as basically anybody to generate something and have a discussion around that. Now, when you do that, you not necessarily generate architecture or good design. You generate things which relate to what you were thinking. But that is fantastic, because now you can use this material which you generate and have that in a discussion with designer, with professionals, and so on. So if you think about a community engagement, so that the city wants to build something new, and conventionally was that, well, there was maybe a community meeting, so we want to build that, and somebody, an architect or anybody, brought a sketch or one rendering and said, you know, do you like A or B? And everybody looked at it. Well, I don't really know. Actually, none of them, or you ask me A, right? But not really understanding what it is. Now with these tools which I showed you and this availability, you now as a user, as a citizen, can be part of it and be active part of it. And you can show certain solutions and you can say, well, this is what I want. And now as a professional or the city can take that information and say, okay, how can we now transform that it becomes a real thing? So I think this is fantastic, right? VR, AR is something which will stay with us. You know, everything has its waves. It's just now, you know, there's different hypes now with AI, which covers a certain thing, but the possibilities which one has with this technology is just so wide that I see that will really influence our environment more and more.
Thank you very much for the talk. And as you know, I'm very interested in the recreations of digital copy of a cultural heritage property. And in your experience, is there any barriers, ethical concerns when we create a property like this? And this also to do with your question about inclusive designs in the digital realms. Because the example of Kashgar's, they demolished the building. Then why there is the interest to know digital copy? Well, I'm saying that not from the creator perspective. I'm asking that from the user perspective. And what's the ethical consideration or barrier when we want to create a digital copy of heritage and to put it in practice in the real world as a tourism product?
This is it's a very philosophical question, actually, because you ask what is the value of something and who defines the value. So if I go to a museum and I see a very ancient vase, I don't really have a direct relationship to it. I maybe cherish it because I'm in the museum and the text tells me it's very ancient, it's very expensive. So there must be heritage, there must be value to it. But is it my value? I don't know, right? And the same thing if you now go into an architecture, to everything, right? How far do we project the value into the physical, or is that what we project at value actually independent of the physical? And that becomes a discussion, for example, when you look in more Western or Eastern heritage of the physical world. In the Western is like, you find the stone and that's the holy stone and that is exactly that's what you want to preserve. And it doesn't matter, it falls down from somewhere, you keep it there, or even if you rebuild it and you mark that it was that stone and the other one is new. While in a more Asian context, it's the spirit of what the building, what it means. So you rebuild the building. So if you go in Japan, they rebuild the temples every couple of years because they want to have that building and a thing in a pristine context and say, it's not the material, it's what it stands for, what we put in there. Now, if you take these different philosophy into the digital realm, it's basically the same thing. Now, if I now preserve something digitally, is it a physical, is it a close copy to reality, so photographic real or 3D model real, or do I preserve the spirit of it, what it actually stands for and the interaction and certain aspect to it? And the next part is, do I preserve things which only existed digitally? A lot of things what we do now only exist digital. So for example, the AI rendering which I showed, they're not real. This is only digital. So in 50 years' time, do we want to preserve these images and say, well, this was the early AI images? So there is a lot of things in terms of how we deal with it. And I think this is a discussion which the society has to have about things, and that will change over time, and people treasure certain things in a certain time and then not anymore later. But this is how how we always deal with heritage and with value, that it's about how we as people come together and agree on certain things and define ourselves with these things as what we are.
Listening to, you know, what you're saying about like restoration, stuff like that. Like she was talking about the Kaskar. I don't know if you can hear me. Oh, there we go. Like where I come from, in New York City, they're doing a lot of restoring older. Well, I mean, nothing back home where I come from is anything as old as here, but like an old rail line in Manhattan, they call it the High Line.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be just like this abandoned railroad track, and they turned it into a park. It's pretty well known. And also, they're wanting to like convert an abandoned underground subway tunnel into like an underground park using artificial light and stuff like that. So that's interesting. You're talking about like kind of like recycling things. And I was just wondering if you had experience with that other than the Kaskar.
Yes, no, I mean the recycling and the reuse is a very important topic, and it will be in China a very big topic, because a lot of things is built up, and we have to think about, we cannot only build new and we cannot just demolish things. How can we reuse and we can treasure, and how can we repurpose certain spaces and bring back value to them? And that's actually a very interesting part, right? So you have a space which was a very functional space, let's say the underground space. What is the right way to reuse it and put new life into that, or to replace that? And this is maybe when we look at the beginning, I showed the design studio here through the tunnel, which connects us what we use. So it's a functional space, but we repurposed it in a very different way. And it's successful and it works. It's maybe not something for all the time, but that was a very successful pilot, you could say. Now the same thing you can use now in a digital context, where you say I can prototype that virtually and I can explore that. Is that something which people would enjoy, and would it work? I can test that, I can simulate that before I actually spend really big money on it. So these tools allows us to validate certain design ideas, and we test that. On the other hand, you can say, well, I do an alternative version to the real one. So you build your underground park, which you do there, but you build a version which is digital, which is not the park, which is a very different park, which is a different relationship. And you can see of how that interacts with each other. So, right? How do you now superimpose the information, which is only a virtual one, with the real one, and how can that live together and have a discussion?
If not, our time is up.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Let's thank Professor Marc for his wonderful talk today and inspiring lecture. And thank you, all of you, for being with us. And we will see you at our next year.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.